This is House Planning Help episode 40. Hi, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to build a new energy efficient house or remodel an existing property. I'm exploring what homes we should be building in the 21st century ahead of my own project that I want to complete by August 2016. Coming up in this session is Martin Holladay from Green Building Advisor, and we look at whether the Passivhaus standard is a world standard. So, welcome. Do you know, it feels like ages since I've done this, but then for me it has been a few weeks, perhaps a little bit longer than I intended, because I've been in the United States at a conference. It's called New Media Expo, and it was an absolute blast. It's really for a lot of the stuff that I do at Regen Media, just trying to find out more about blogging and podcasting so that we can help our clients, and this is all about building up community. So I made some brilliant connections out there. Unfortunately, if you haven't heard yet, I had a little bit too much fun and ended up getting very little sleep, which meant ultimately pressing the self-destruct button. So if this is all brand new to you, then what I'm going to do is link into the show notes this extended story, because I don't think this is the right place to be telling it. But Ellery Wells, who I met out there, asked me if I could tell him about my NMX experience and what happened afterwards. So I will link that up, houseplanninghelp.com/40 if you'd like to go and listen to that. But have you ever seen the movie The Hangover? If you have, to me, it felt just like that. All in Las Vegas as well. Very, very bizarre. I do have some other observations about Las Vegas that I wanted to share with you. Firstly, it's weird. It really is, because I didn't see this one coming, that I probably had one of the best experiences of my life in Las Vegas, this place that sums up a lot of the things that I think are wrong about the world, and yet I have this brilliant experience meeting fantastic people in this place. So that was the first one, a personal point. But as I mentioned, everything is huge. Buildings, highways, cars, food portions. They even seem to have those horrible outdoor heaters everywhere. Oh, that drives me crazy, when you could just go and sit inside, but instead you sit outside and have a gas heater warming you out there. Yeah, I struggle with that one all the time. But several times I did think to myself, this is one of those places that almost we should preserve. Just one place, the old school way of doing it, to remind us that we should never go down this route again of just excess. That's what it says to me. And just to highlight some of the difficulties that this city might have in the future, it doesn't have any nearby water. Yes, it's got a river that's quite some way away and all the water's pumped in. But even then, at the Hoover Dam, I got an opportunity to go there on a tour, and the water level had dropped by 80 feet. I wish I'd found out over what period of time, but that's a huge drop. This is a massive expanse of water that we're talking about. And when I asked the question, is it likely to fill up again in the near future? The one-sided answer was, it's just going down. And that provides water for other cities as well that are along the coastline there. So some water issues definitely on the horizon in the next 20, 30 years. Another separate issue here, not an issue, a total pleasure. I bumped into Lloyd Alter out there. I make it sound like an accident, but we had planned this, because when I'd started talking about going to Las Vegas, he said, well, actually, I'm going to another one of the conferences out there. Why don't we meet up? And that was brilliant to meet him, to shake his hand, to have a beer, particularly because he did some really entertaining tweets about Vegas that I didn't think of doing. I tried to retweet them if you follow my stream at Ben Adam Smith. But Lloyd was episode 35. If you haven't checked that out, go back and have a listen, because he's a great guy, and that was an opportunity. He even said he's coming back to the UK soon, so I look forward to catching up with him when he comes here. We'll host him. And one final point about my trip, this was on the way home. The plane I took was empty, and I'm going to put a picture into the show notes of one of the cabins, just so you know that what empty means. I could be exaggerating here, but I have not manipulated this in any way. Put my hands up, I promise I won't do that. I'm just intrigued that they can fly planes like this. I will say that on the way out, it was full, but if it goes empty on the way back, there must be a better system of just making sure that we're always, whenever flying, carrying the maximum amount of people possible. Just an idea. Rant over anyway. Should we get to business? I think so. Green Building Advisor provides some great information for those who want to get down and analyse the technical details. What works, what doesn't work. And I must admit, sometimes Even though I enjoy reading it, a lot of it goes over my head. I guess it's aimed at industry people and I'm just keen to learn, so I just take in what information I can. Martin Holladay is a senior editor and he's a man that I've wanted to get onto the podcast for some time. He was keen to talk about some of the pros and cons of the Passivhaus standard, which opens up actually into a discussion about whether it's the best approach for all climates. I started by asking Martin how he got to work at Green Building Advisor.
Well, for years I worked as a builder and remodeler, building single-family homes, additions and renovations in northern Vermont, in the northeast part of the U.S. Then about, 15 years ago, I got a job as an editor at the Journal of Light Construction, which is a monthly magazine in the U.S. And from there, I switched to Energy Design Update, a monthly newsletter that was founded in the mid-1980s to focus on super insulation. And I was there for 7 years and then moved on to work for a new website called Green Building Advisor, where I've been ever since.
I know as well that you were involved in those early passive solar homes over in the States. So I'm very interested about this whole movement because we've touched on it once before in a podcast, but only in passing. So what was your involvement? What house did you build and how did it go on from there?
Well, I can't claim to have been part of the early pioneer group of those building passive solar houses, but I was well aware of what was going on. I was relatively young when I built my first house, which was in the early 1970s, and I followed passive solar principles, which at that point were fairly well known, which was, to orient the main axis of the house in an east-west direction, to put most of your windows on the south side of the house, and few, if any, windows on the north, and so on and so forth. The house was a classic hippie house in the sense that it was thrown together with found materials and inexpensive stuff picked up at the dump and thrown away by others. And it leaked like a sieve. Like most houses of the era, we didn't know much about airtightness in those days. And especially poor hippies without any money had few recourses for building really tight houses. So that was a learning house, but it was an example of those early principles. And there was quite a movement of builders, far more sophisticated than I was when I was 18 years old, who built houses based on research mostly done in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, which have climates quite suited to passive solar design. And those early so-called solar houses were seen as one response to the energy crisis.
Maybe you can explain what passive solar is, or does it just go along those same concepts that you've just gone over?
Well, the early solar years, dating back to MIT researchers in the 1940s, looked at different ways to collect solar energy, and they were usually divided categorically into active solar systems, which had pumps and blowers and some mechanism for storing solar heat. If it was a solar air system, the heat was usually stored in a rock bin, usually in the basement, which was literally a large bin of rocks through which heated air would be blown. And then the air would later be blown through the rocks on a cold night, and some of the heat would be gathered up that way. Or more commonly in large tanks of water. And solar collectors on the roof, water collectors or air collectors would, with the means of pumps or blowers, transfer this heat to the storage system. In a passive solar house, the idea was no pumps, no blowers. And you simply used the design of the house to maximize solar gain. And so by putting most of the windows on the south side of the house and fewer on the north, these houses would heat up quite nicely on a clear, sunny day. They had a lot of drawbacks because they also lost a tremendous amount of heat on cold winter nights because of the large amounts of south-facing glazing. So they had the reputation of being very uncomfortably hot on sunny days and uncomfortably cold at night. And this reputation was fairly well deserved for the early passive solar houses.
How did it move on from there? This was obviously a good idea of using the energy from the sun and perhaps storing it in some thermal mass. But you were talking about the 1970s and we're 2014 now. So what's in the gap in between?
Well, I think what most people look at as a kind of pioneering house was the Saskatchewan Conservation House. And what it really tried to do, instead of simply gather solar energy, although it did that as well, was to experiment with super insulation. And it was a house that was built on airtight principles, was tested at about zero 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals, which by coincidence turns out to have been the same level of air tightness advocated by Dr. Wolfgang Feist in his Passivhaus standard. It had R40 walls and R60 ceilings. Again, this is using the R value as it's expressed in North America. These aren't metric values. And it had triple glazed windows. And these types of specifications have been recommended ever since in cold northern climates for super insulated houses. And the house performed extraordinarily well, and the principles were widely copied by a very enthusiastic band of builders. And this idea of super insulation was taken up by Ned Nissen, who founded the newsletter that I later edited, Energy Design Update. And through Ned Nissen's efforts, as well as the efforts of these Canadian researchers, these ideas were promulgated widely. A book was written in 1985 called the Super Insulated House Book, and a whole movement advocating super insulated houses took up. And what you had at that point were two somewhat contradictory, or certainly opposing, views of the best way to build a low energy house. The traditional passive solar people thought that, you could get there by collecting lots of energy. And the super insulation people thought collection of energy was not really the issue. The issue was building a tight enough envelope that you didn't lose energy. And on balance, I think the super insulated group has been proven correct. And a lot of the early ideas of so-called solar house design have long since been abandoned or modified.
I know that you were keen to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Passivhaus. So after what you've just mentioned there, does that take us up to the Passivhaus standard? What is different between what you were talking about there and the Passivhaus standard?
Well, I think advocates of super insulation in the late 1980s and throughout the 90s in the US didn't have rigid targets. They certainly used blower doors to check their air tightness, and many of them competed for the lowest air leakage number they could come up with and bragged about how low they had gotten. They generally understood that in a cold climate, you want triple glazed windows with a high solar gain coefficient on the south side and low U factors on the other sides. And they generally understood you wanted thick insulation everywhere, but there were no magic numbers that you had to aim for. When Dr. Wolfgang Feist in Darmstadt, Germany, decided to develop a standard that he chose to call the Passivhaus standard in the mid to late 90s, he decided some, what I think are fairly arbitrary goals for annual energy use, the most famous of which is 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. By pegging an energy budget on the standard, he required cold climate builders to invest an extraordinary amount of money in insulation that will never foreseeably be recovered in any possible energy savings. And when true believers in the US started copying the Germans using the Central European standard in our climates, they were ending up with 14 inches of rigid foam under their concrete slabs. They were ending up with R100 insulation in their attics. And they were sometimes paying $6,000 or $10,000 for reducing tiny amounts of annual energy use that could easily have been supplied by a $400 solar panel producing electricity. And it was this kind of absurdity that created a backlash in North America. And somewhat surprisingly, the backlash was so well argued that Katrin Klingenberg has come around. She was the one who founded the Passivhaus Institute US, and she has organized a committee to try to come up with a new Passivhaus standard that works for North American climates, which I think is a recognition that the Darmstadt, Germany standard has no global validity.
This is quite interesting. Obviously, you know that my knowledge is fairly limited, but if I understand you correctly, what you are saying here is that it does change according to the climate that you're in. You feel the effectiveness, it doesn't work quite so well where you are in North America.
Well, super insulation principles work everywhere, with the possible exception of a mild climate where no space heating or cooling is required. It obviously is silly to have highly insulated walls in Hawaii, where the most pleasant climate is to simply open the windows and enjoy the breezes coming off the Pacific Ocean. But in most climates where you need air conditioning or heating, insulation makes sense. The question is, do we want to be spending tens of thousands of dollars for very thick insulation when the amount of money we invest is far more than will ever be saved in 100 years of operation? And that's the absurd situation we're now seeing in America by architects promoting the German Passivhaus standard. So common sense says you don't insulate infinitely. You want to insulate to a point where you achieve some cost effectiveness. If you double the thickness of your insulation, you cut your heat loss in half. But each time you double it, you're spending more and saving less. So the traditional way to determine when to stop insulating is determined by cost effectiveness. You guess at the lifespan of the building, you guess future energy costs, you put a dollar figure on the amount of energy you will pay over the lifetime of the building, and you try not to spend more on insulation than will ever be saved in energy. Recently, with global warming concerns, there are additional questions, which is our moral responsibility not to foul up the planet. But we also need to engage in global warming mitigation efforts that are also cost effective. It can be argued that very thick insulation saves the planet, but if we are focused on houses for the wealthy that are extraordinarily expensive, we may not be investing our dollars where we can do the most good to reduce CO2 levels. So all of these issues require a sharp pencil and careful thought. It's easier to do this in central Germany, where Dr. Wolfgang Feist developed his standard, than it is in northern Vermont, where I live, or in northern Minnesota, because our winters are colder than his. And that's why his target cannot be cost effectively attained. We need to use less insulation than the Passivhaus standard would require in our climate. That may be exactly as much insulation as he uses in Darmstadt, but we will end up perhaps spending 10 or 15 more dollars a year than Dr. Feist would like, and that will allow us to save $6,000 in insulation.
Should we be looking at anything else, comfort, for example? Or again, is it just something that's not relevant in certain climates where it's actually the climate provides the comfort?
Well, Dr. Feist makes a good point, and he picked it up from super insulation pioneers in the US, that the advantage of a good thermal envelope is it's more comfortable. You want your interior surfaces to be close enough to the interior air temperature that your skin is not radiating heat to the cold outdoors during the winter. And the classic example is a single or double pane window on a very cold night. The interior surface of that glass is so cold that if I sit beside the window, my skin will feel cold, even if the air temperature is at what we would consider normal interior air temperature of perhaps 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's because our skin radiates heat to cold surfaces. So by changing that double glazed window to a triple glazed window, we become more comfortable. After this basic goal is achieved and the interior surfaces are within, let's say, 15 degrees Fahrenheit of the interior air temperature, perhaps 10, depending, you become comfortable enough that further insulation isn't in any way detectable by the human body. So if I have 4 inches of rigid foam under my floor, I will have a comfortable floor. If I change that to 14 inches of rigid foam under my floor, as the Passivhaus standard requires in a cold climate, my feet will not feel the difference.
Very interesting what you're saying here. So what does that mean going forwards then? What should we be thinking about if climate change is our goal and we want to be the most effective? Is it using renewables?
Well, first of all, I'm very much in favor of super insulation principles, especially improving the airtightness of ordinary construction. So I think the Passive House movement deserves our credit for focusing on the right things. Moving forward, we certainly need to remember that Passive House is not a religion. It shouldn't be blindly followed. And I very much hope that it doesn't become enshrined in our building codes because it takes away flexibility from builders. That's number one. In terms of renewable energy, we absolutely have to go forward to a fossil fuel-free future if we're going to save the planet and preserve it for our kids. And that generally means a massive investment in photovoltaic arrays and wind turbines, to some extent tidal energy, and perhaps even new forms of geothermal energy using earth heat. There may be a few other types of energy we can depend on. And so I think one of the priorities now that we need to emphasize is we should resist the unfortunate tendency that, well, I see this in our country. I don't know if you have it in the UK, where local interests oppose wind turbines, or local interests oppose, in some cases, even PV installations because they are afraid that it will be an aesthetic detriment to their neighborhood. And as a result, we're finding it harder and harder to site renewable energy installations in the US when we really have to move forward at a faster pace, not a slower pace. So I find that a little dismaying.
Are there any other drawbacks, just going back to Passive House for a moment, that we should highlight just before we move on?
Well, right now the problem is cost, and I think the other thing to say is that the Passive House movement in the U.S. is focused very, very strongly on new construction. And, it doesn't take much simple math on the back of an envelope to point out that the timetable for building new homes is an entirely different timetable from the one required by our climate crisis. I mean, we really have got to get a handle on this crisis within the next 10 or 15 years, or we're very much in trouble. And building new homes for, frankly, mostly wealthy people to very high super insulation standards does not address this issue. We need a massive focus on what's referred to as weatherization in America, which is the improvement in the energy performance of existing homes. And we also need all kinds of other measures which have nothing to do with construction. So I think to some extent, a focus on Passive House is a little bit of a red herring when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. We need to eliminate and close down all our coal plants. We need to actually reduce the amount of energy each family uses. We need to change our transportation system. And we need to weatherize our existing buildings. Those, I think, are far more urgent than focusing on new construction.
Well, let's have a couple of questions then that have come in. One from Twitter, first of all, and this is Ure Mukurchik, and he says, what's the biggest barrier in the uptake of large-scale multifamily passive house in the US?
Well, probably the existing building codes and the fact that energy is so cheap. We have had a few multifamily passive house projects in the U.S., and we've reported on them on Green Building Advisor. But right now, the building code allows much lower levels of insulation. And with energy so cheap, right now they're almost giving natural gas away in the U.S. It's hardly pays it for a commercial developer to even think about these issues.
There's one from David Cummings from Bolton Landing in New York who wanted to know, what are your thoughts on the marriage between natural building and passive house and embodied energy?
Well, I assume by natural building he means using materials like straw bales, mud, adobe, and so on. I think that there's a lot of potential to using some of those materials for energy efficient construction. Others, frankly, don't really perform that well from the perspective of having a high R value assembly. I think straw bale is the most promising of the natural building materials because a straw bale wall has a fairly decent R value, and once it's plastered on both sides, as they almost always are, it's quite airtight. So I see a lot of promise for straw bale construction if an owner builder has a lot of spare time and lives somewhere where straw bales are inexpensive. That's one approach. These methods aren't ever going to be adopted on a wide scale because the labor involved costs too much. And if you have to pay someone to build according to these natural principles, you're going to have a very expensive house that only the very wealthy can afford.
But you can have a small house. You don't have to go crazy. And is that not one of the lessons that we're probably going to learn?
Absolutely. And we try to emphasize that on the Green Building Advisor website as much as possible. It's the most important thing you can do in planning a new house is to build small. I agree completely.
Thomas Langley has a question via email, slightly longer, so let me read you some of this. For me, a question that has come up from speaking with a range of greenhouse builders is whether to pay the extra to go all the way to Passivhaus standard or do as they all recommend and compromise on air tightness to save money. It's a matter of value for money in finding every last leak and getting the certificate. When does it become uneconomic to continue? Every house builder I've spoken to dies not to recommend bothering going to Passivhaus certification, but to stop with an earlier compromise while still valuing the envelope fabric first approach. Is this more or less what we've been talking about, the core of what you've said today?
Well, I think the cost effectiveness of air tightening measures that are necessary for achieving the Passivhaus standard are far more justified than the insulation levels. Most builders who care and get excited about the concept of airtight construction learn very quickly. They may have one house, which is kind of a learning house where they realize the effects of, sloppy construction. But once they get it, once they integrate the use of gaskets, foam, and caulk into their everyday lives, it happens on its own. I mean, I think it could be argued that and the 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals that is required by Passivhaus, I don't think it's set in stone. I mean, a lot of people are quite happy with 1.5, but that's different from saying, let's just give up and use ordinary building practices. Ordinary building practices in the US often result in 8 air changes per hour or 6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. We can do much, much better than that with hardly any investment. And if we just pay attention, it's not hard to get to 1 air change per hour. So I don't think we have to berate ourselves if we don't quite meet 0.6, but we should get as close to that as we can.
Are you saying that air tightness is the most important factor when we talk about not losing heat and saving energy just because of what we've mentioned about insulation varying according to climate?
Yes.
Okay. That one sums that one up nice and neatly. Very good, Martin. Well, you've had some fantastic information for us today, so I thank you for that. But I just wondered, are there any closing thoughts, or is there a question that I should have asked you to get a bit more information today? What should we finish on?
I don't know if that's closing thoughts, but the advice I've given is focused for has a U.S. perspective, and I could well be contradicted by a British builder because what you do in your country is likely very different from what we do in the U.S., and in some cases probably better or more advanced. So that's a kind of general caveat to everything I've said.
Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
And you can find out more about Martin Holladay in our show notes for this episode. Today it's houseplanninghelp.com/40. And I'd particularly like to hear from you if you're someone who works in the industry. I know often when I do these interviews, I think it shouldn't be me doing this. It should be someone who can come up with the relevant arguments where I just sit there and think, I don't know what to say now. But maybe there is a good counter argument when it comes to reducing the insulation. Is there a reason why all that insulation is there? I certainly couldn't think of one. Also, I have a question for you. If you're someone who's building a house, I'd like to know, is getting Passivhaus certification important for your project? Tell me why. I have a call to action for this episode, and that is to subscribe to our email newsletter. Why would you do this? Well, let me give you some reasons. First of all, it's packed full of lots of information, just like you've been getting on this podcast, or if you read the blog, or if you've watched any of our videos, but you get more of it. And also, we share resources and keep you up to date with future guests. It's a place to interact too. So houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe if you'd like to sign up there. We certainly would like you to do that. Next time, I don't have a guest. Oh dear. Is it poor planning? No, actually, this is going to be an odd one because I'm flying solo. I want to share 5 fundamentals to creating a better house. The reason that I'm doing this is because I'm finally ready to release my ebook, which is called Why Most People Don't Build Energy Efficient Homes. This is bringing together the research from year 1 at House Planning Help. So very excited about that. I'll catch up with you then.